Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you're here. I would like to introduce Dr. Gregory Bradley. Since 2019, Dr. Greg Bradley has served as the Dean of the College of Business and Technology at United States University. He also holds the rank of Professor of Management at the institution. He previously served as a professor of business at multiple institutions and has won numerous teaching awards throughout his career. As an example, he was named a distinguished teaching scholar at one of his previous institutions and has been named Faculty Member of the Year on multiple occasions. Of note, his academic leadership experience includes over 7 years as the Dean of the Graduate School at North Central University, where he was responsible for doctoral programs in business, education, and psychology. He is also the founder and president of the Bradley Research Group, a 28-year-old applied research and decision analytics firm. His field of expertise is the application of mathematics and statistics in solving complex business and social problems. He has been the principal investigator/primary researcher on over 1,700 private and public research projects related predominantly to either evaluating the relationships between and among employee/customer behavior and firm performance, or measuring the economic impact of prescribed events. He frequently collaborates with researchers across the globe concerning the innovative application of research outcomes, particularly at the confluence of the behavioral sciences, organizational development, and economics. Dr. Bradley has spoken at several domestic and international conferences and has authored a variety of research articles related to improving the decision-making process through quantitative analysis. Dr. Bradley's research on the economic impact of the 2010 Gulf of Mexico oil spill led to a landmark settlement resulting in over $53 million per year in regional investment through 2033. Moreover, Dr. Bradley's research on the impact of COVID-19 and how to interpret conflicting scientific information gained international recognition. His seminal systematic literature review in this area of research is one of the most comprehensive studies on the topic. Since 2013, Dr. Bradley has visited Cuba 20 times and has spent over 140 nights in Havana during that time frame. He has lectured multiple times on behavioral economics to postgraduate psychology students at the University of Havana. His experience in lecturing to Cuban students has significantly broadened his understanding of the Cuban people, their rich heritage and culture, and their underlying economic system. In 2015, Dr. Bradley was awarded the prestigious Letter of Acknowledgement from the Cuban Society of Psychology. In 2016, Dr. Bradley was invited to present on Cuba's economy at Hominis, a hemispheric psychology conference held in Havana biannually. He is currently writing a book on Cuba's efforts at economic transformation. Personally, Dr. Bradley lives in Biloxi, Mississippi, where he spends his spare time training for and competing in endurance events to include long-distance triathlons, ultras, and marathons. He is also an avid sports fan. Welcome, Dr. Bradley. We are so honored to have you presenting to us today.
Thank you, Linda. Those introductions always look good on paper till you start hearing it, and then it's cringy when you hear your own name called like that. So, but thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Look, there are a million ways we could do this. I have so much. I mean, the problem is distilling the information into something that's digestible, that's rather comprehensive but enjoyable. So, the old adage, I would have written you a short letter, but I didn't have the time. uh, that's kind of what we're doing here is I'm trying to distill some information and make it conversational. I can't even tell you how many stories I have. I've done this presentation or a presentation similar to this uh, over between 40 and 50 times over the since 2013. But mostly in long form where in podcast or workshops, whether it be 2 or 3 hours. So that was easy to kind of run through all the material, that sort of thing. Here, I'm just going to pick and choose, and I'm sure that in some cases stories will come to mind um, that I think that you might enjoy. I'll start by just telling you how I got into this, which was it was a little bit bizarre to begin with, and some of the I know that Heather will know some of the folks involved, um, but my partner in crime in this entire Cuba venture and remains to this day one of my very best friends is a guy named Bill Ray. Um, and actually, I met Bill through Heather probably back in 2008, I'm guessing. Bill has a PhD in psychology from the University of Nebraska and also has a law degree from the University of Nebraska and owns the largest behavioral health system in Nebraska called Omni Behavioral Health. And so Bill is keenly interested in a number of things, and we have a lot of similarities. And if you've ever met Bill, you'll never forget him because he's a massive risk taker. He's very smart, but he is not afraid to take ridiculous amounts of risk and can convince anyone that it's a good idea. And he's done that with me on multiple occasions, and now I'm grateful for it. But Bill came to me one day and says, "Hey, buddy, you want to go to Cuba?" I said, "What? How are we going to do that?" And so he explained that the American Orthopsychiatric Association was going over to Cuba on a somewhat of an exchange. The trade-off would be that we would write um, some research on our areas of interest and present that in Cuba, and they would in turn do the same. And we would spend a week kind of learning about the culture, et cetera. And so we did that. But it was very interesting because when we got on so we stage and this is the one of what is now 22 trips. I forgot two of those in this introduction. But we always stage in Miami, Coconut Grove, et cetera. And then there are very specific charter flights that go down. For a while there were some commercial flights that were allowed, but then that was discontinued um, probably in 2018, I believe. But so on the way over, so we're with these folks, the American Ortho Psychiatric Association, and I didn't know any of these people. But on the way over, I was sitting next to a gentleman. His name was Andy. Started talking to him and was fascinated. So he was a former. He lived in Cuba. He and his family had to leave Cuba during the revolution and all of their property and their business obviously was taken away as well. And this guy happened to be I don't know if any of you remember Elian Gonzalez and the controversy with Elian Gonzalez, who was returned to his father's custody after an INS raid on his Miami relative's home in 2020. Well, anyway, Andy was his psychiatrist. He was hired by our government to be his psychiatrist. He's from Cuba. He had not been back since 1960. And it was exceedingly emotional. I'm sitting next to him on the plane, and when we landed in Cuba, I looked over and he was teared up. And I think about it now. I mean, this was 40 years later, and Andy was going back for the first time. He was a child when he had to leave. And he told me, he says, he said, and he didn't tell me this till on the way back. But so I made a point to sit with him on the way back because I wanted to hear everything he had to say. And and Andy is one of the world's leading experts on suicide. Uh, I mean, he is the person that has written most of the seminal literature in the last, I would say, 20 years for sure. But on the way back, he was just full of joy. He was very happy. But one of the, it just this story sticks with me, and I knew this would happen. We haven't gotten off the first slide yet, and I'm already telling these long form stories. But Andy says, he says, I left a pair of my tennis shoes in the room. I said, Andy, why'd you do that? Did you forget them? He says, no, 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 I did it on purpose. He said, the very last thing that a person said anything to me in Cuba was a Cuban guard when I think he was probably 8 years old. And the Cuban guard made him take off his tennis shoes and says, we'll keep those as well, as he was getting on the plane to fly to the United States. And this was Andy's way of closure by leaving someone in Cuba those tennis shoes at a different point in his life. And so I learned a lot about just generally about Cuba and things of that nature from Andy on the flight back. Got back home, and I was still processing a lot of this information, right? I mean, uh, Cuba is, I mean, it's if you look at the Economic Freedom Index, it is second to last. The last is North Korea, and Cuba is second to last, and it is very oppressive. The government is very oppressive. It is. I see the word socialism tossed around, but this is a communist country. There is no, there's no doubt about that. And so I was processing a lot of information, a lot of things I've seen. And, over the course of the years, I've probably taken, I'm going to guess between 2,000 and 3,000 pictures, and with some of them with unfettered access. And so I have, and I have some photos in here that I've taken. Um, some of them I couldn't find. They're on another computer, unfortunately. But even had access to inside Cuban classrooms for children, uh, pictures of ration houses, things that normally you wouldn't think they would allow, and they may not. But I certainly I did. So we came back. I was processing, and Bill had already begun planning our trip, meaning just him and I coming back later that year. The first trip over was sponsored by a university. The second trip over was funded by a nonprofit organization that Bill happened to run called the Coalition of Research to Practice. And that continued to fund our trips, or most of our trips, throughout the time period from 2013 through about 2018. We were going quite often. And so the second trip, we made it a point. So and look, there's a long process, right? I mean, I don't know if many of you know about, our embargo, our trade embargo with Cuba, and there's been a very contentious relationship between the governments, the Cuban Missile Crisis, all those things that we look back in history. Um, there was some risk. I mean, there's been foreigners imprisoned in Cuba for what seemed like minor offenses. And a lot of those things that Cuba does is it tells a different message to the world, that sort of thing. So there was some concern there, but the upside, the reward side of this was so high that that I decided, well, what the heck? I think we should go back. I think we should attempt to continue to meet those people that that can help us, learn more about the country, et cetera. So we went back December the same year. The first time we went was March of 2013. Went back in December the same year, and yet this time we spent a lot of time at the University of Havana. We met the dean of the University of the College of Psychology, and we also met the president of the Cuban Psychological Association or Society, which also happened to be a professor at the University of Havana. We made, really good contacts there. We indicated that we would really be interested in some form of exchange and would be interested in access and discussions, et cetera. And this was at a time where, well, there was a lot of things going on. Uh, Raul Castro was now in charge. Fidel Castro had not passed away yet, but he was sick, and his brother Raul was in charge. And Raul in 2013 announced that he intended to begin economic reform in Cuba. And this is what piqued my interest. I'm a behavioral economist, and this was at the very beginning of that declaration. And so it also was at a time where the scholars in Cuba had taken upon themselves to attempt to exacerbate or increase the velocity of this change by introducing, you know, Americans and others to their university, et cetera. And so the timing was perfect. By the time we left in December of 2013, we had already been sketching out plans to come back and lecture to Cuban University of Havana students for credit. And so that began a long litany of visits. The velocity of the frequency of those visits were typically 3 to 4 to 5 times a year that we were going, and we were lecturing for a full 40-hour week. Me on behavioral economics, Bill on the law and the Constitution, which is just fascinating that they would allow either one of those to take place with American professors. And we were one of the only few American professors that had lectured since the Revolution. I think there were one or two others, but one of the very few. And it was challenging. I mean, the University of Havana is a beautiful campus, but the facilities, there are some facilities that are not great. I can recall one time where they also have some underground classrooms where there are no windows. And one time, in any given time during one of those week-long lectures, I would have between 30 and 40 students. And Bill and I would trade. So I would lecture for 2 hours on behavioral economics, and then I would give those students to Bill, and Bill would give me his students, and we would go back and forth. And there was a very specific program, and it was monitored by at least by the academic side at the University of Havana. And obviously our State Department knew everything we were doing because we're required to file, we have to get permission to travel. And we were very transparent about what we were doing and what we had planned to do. And so I felt okay about that. But you just never know what's going to happen once you get over. So the important thing was to establish those relationships and continue that conversation. So when we got over the second time, we also found through extensive search two very good translators and a driver. And so we essentially employed them to work for us. And those translators, especially one of them, his name was Alex, went with us everywhere. Explained to us a lot of the context of what was happening, at various events. And I found myself at the cacophony of many events in Cuba that were unexpected. I was there believe it or not, I mean, I was in Cuba in an untimely way for the death of many world leaders. Um, I was trying to think about all the world leaders that had died while I was there, and that was important because when a world leader dies, the island shuts down. They don't do anything. There is at least 2 or 3 days of mourning, no music, and no, very few restaurants open. So I was there when Hugo Chavez from Venezuela died, and he's revered, and I'll explain why in a minute. I was there when Nelson Mandela died. He was revered. revered. I was there when King Abdullah from Saudi Arabia passed away. I was there when Helmut Schmidt passed away. And then I was there in November of 2016 when Fidel Castro passed away. And then so it was an interesting time, and it gave me it did open a window for how this country operated. And I'll give you an example. When Hugo Chavez passed away, and he was revered because at that particular time, Cuba and Venezuela had a massive trade compact in which Cubans were exporting uh, medical physicians for oil. And Cuba, very smart. They're doing more than exporting medical physicians. They're exporting their belief system and their culture, and in exchange for oil. And it really had propped up um, the Cuban economy. And Chavez was responsible for making that deal. So he was revered, and when he died, um, news got out quickly. And in Revolution Square, and I don't know if you're familiar with Revolution Square, but this is where Castro gave all his powerful, strong revolution type speeches to the masses. And so you can probably fit in Revolution Square 5 to 700,000 people, somewhere in that neighborhood. And so the gathering in the morning was going to be at Revolution Square, and Bill and I says, "Well, what the heck? Let's go." And so we went, and I was just fascinated. So hundreds of thousands of people, buses. So school kids from all over the island were being bussed in. It was just fascinating, and I was filming the whole time on my phone, and we were getting yelled at. I mean, hey, go home, Americano, blah blah blah. It was nothing threatening, but honestly, this film, and I haven't watched it in a long time. It's just fascinating to watch. Um, so again, learning more and more about the Cuban culture and its massive complexities was important for me to gain some context about what I would learn over time. So let's get back to the original topic, which is their attempt at economic reform. So let me see if I can. There we go. So as you can see, and all these pictures were taken by me on an iPhone. So ultimately, my returning to Cuba, 22 7-day visits. And I lectured at the University of Havana for 14 separate weeks. So that's 14 different visits. It was related to my desire to fully understand their attempts at economic reform, because I knew that they were a communist country, and there were just too many barriers in place from my perspective to be successful. And this is my academic interest and research interest, and so I was fascinated. And I learned just how complex and evolving this process was, shaped by both internal and external pressures that probably took me 10 to 15 visits to fully understand. And I'd learned as much about the history as I possibly could before I went. And so for example, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, which significantly impacted Cuba. Cuba was the primary economic benefactor from the Soviet Union, and when when Cuba, I mean, when Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba went into what they call now their special period. And I'll talk a little more about that special period over time, but the country faced severe shortages in fuel, food, and other essential goods, prompting the government to introduce limited market-oriented reforms to stimulate the economy. And
Yeah.
it was significant. They at that time they legalized the U.S. dollar. So the government allowed the use of U.S. dollars alongside the Cuban peso to attract remittances from Cuban exiles living mainly in Florida and Miami. And there was a pretty significant expansion at that time in 93, 94 of the private sector. So the government permitted self-employment in certain industries, such as restaurants, taxis, artisans, And this had a significant impact because it literally inverted their economy completely. And what I mean by inverted their economy is now you had taxi drivers making more than physicians. And that's because they were able to get their hands on hard currency, hard US currency. See, the Cuba runs a dual economic system. They did forever. They had the Cuban pesos, and I will get to that in a minute. But it was incredibly difficult time for Cuba. The average Cuban, I believe, lost 26 pounds. The average number of calories eaten in a day went from 2,600 to 1,500. Where that's, I mean, that's substantial. About 30% of their calories were lost. Um, and there were a number of other outcomes that if we have time, we'll talk about. But and they helped Cuba survive the economic crisis, but were limited in scope. So they opened up tourism. Tourism expanded significantly, becoming a crucial source of foreign currency. But the Cuban government remained reluctant at that time to deepen market liberalization due to fears of undermining socialism. And so there is a lot of fear among the government in Cuba. So, and this is ultimately, and I'll fast forward to the end of the story real quickly so it'll make more sense. What I've come to believe now, and looking at this attempt at economic reform, and maybe things have changed since we have the new leadership, but under Raul Castro's um, reign in Cuba, I do believe that the primary attempt in economic reform was to stave off civil unrest among the Gen's, the at that time the Gen X crowd, but they were younger. They were in there at that time, but in mid 20s to mid 30s. There was an ongoing access to the internet, although limited and highly censored and highly monitored. But still, Cubans were able to at least gain some perspective about what was going on in the rest of the world. And I believe that there was some protest around that time, and I believe there was some concern. And so Raul Castro came out with these plans for reform, did follow through on some of them, uh, did not follow through on many of them. And the new Cuban government, while still as oppressive as it has ever been, has continued some of these reforms. But if you just look at some of the things that have happened over time, some key reforms during Castro's regime, which was 2008 to 2018. One was the elimination of ration books for some goods. So in Cuba, after the revolution, um, they I mean, they literally took away all private business, right? And most of those people had to leave the country. And so everything was state owned. And so they had to come up with a way because there was a lot of poverty to feed the masses. And one way to do this was with ration books. And you know, it was pretty significant, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But with Castro, he did eliminate some of the ration books for some goods. Um, he expanded private business to a certain degree, especially among private restaurants called paladares. If you did happen to have a building or a house that you could convert, and there were some other like repair shops and rental services. He significantly reduced the state workforce, which means, he moved these people off the state payroll, which was minimal anyway, as far as how much they were paid, but they didn't have a job. And so that was challenging, very challenging. There was a co-op system expansion. The government allowed non-agricultural co-ops, including retail businesses, transportation services, and other trade. Um, he announced a plan for dual currency reform. And as I lectured in Cuba, every time I got the opportunity, I would let my students in Cuba know that whenever this happened, hyperinflation would occur. lo and behold, it finally did happen not that long ago, and hyperinflation did occur in the worst way. And Cuba is going through an exceedingly difficult time right now. Why, during my time visiting Cuba, there was some normalization of Cuba, U.S.-Cuba relations from 14 to 16, especially. I don't know if you remember when Barack Obama went to Cuba, which was a monumental event at the time. I actually went to a baseball game and sat in the international section. I've sat in that very section many times. Um, and so some of those relationships, there was a historic thaw of some frozen relationships, and it led to some increased tourism and some business exchanges. And I believe in 2014, Cuba passed a new law offering some tax incentives to foreign investors and establishing what they called the Mariel Special Development Zone to attract businesses. But ultimately, it was not very successful. The private sector did grow. U.S.-Cuba relations did improve, and it led to a temporary boost in tourism and investment interest. You know, if Americans wanted to go to Cuba prior to that, I mean, they would go through Canada or through Mexico, and you know, it wasn't legal per se, but there were many Americans that visited Cuba before 2013. And then for some reason, Castro delayed the unification plan, which was, you know, because of ongoing financial distortions. And then he stepped down. He's still alive. He's 93 years old, but he stepped down, and Miguel Diaz-Canel took over in 2018. And he was able to actually unify the the Cuban currency, the convertible peso and the Cuban peso, and it's resulted in massive inflation. There was some expansion in the private sector. There was some agricultural market reforms, et cetera. But what are their challenges now, as I see it? And this book that I'm writing is ever changing because of some of these things. But what they're facing right now, hyperinflation, the current currency unification led to rapid devaluation of the peso, resulting in massive inflation and rising cost of living. That's happening right now. There is a worsening food and energy shortage in Cuba. The government has struggled to import essential goods, and which leads to widespread shortages. And there's been mass migration. Economic hardships has led to one of the largest waves of Cuban immigration in history, with many Cubans fleeing to the U.S. and other countries. And let me stop right there and tell you another story. So, I mentioned one of our translators, Alex, and Alex he was in his 30s, full of life, spoke English very, very well, was university educated. He was just fantastic. Became a really, really good friend of mine and Bill's because he would have everything ready for us. He would meet us at the airport. He would take us from Jose Marti Airport to our hotel. He would pick us up and take us everywhere. He would interpret anything we couldn't understand. And most importantly, he would tell us, no, 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 stay away from that person. And hey, let's move on. I think that someone may be, you know, tagging along, which meant following us, if you will, which was, it took me a couple of visits to digest that and become kind of okay with it because it's just part of their, you know, their systemic fabric. But one day, and this was in, I believe, 2018, I am at home and my phone rings and I answer it. And he said, on the other end, it says, Greg, this is Alex. I said, Alex, what are you doing? Are you calling me from Cuba? He says, no. He says, I'm in Miami. I said, wait, you're what? He says, yeah. He says, look, I couldn't tell you because if you knew and you know, you were asked, you would feel obligated to tell the truth. But I've been saving all the money that you guys have been paying me, et cetera. And I bought my way out of Cuba through Central America. So holy cow. First of all, this way is treacherous. And I mean, I was just shocked. And to this day, Alex lives in Minnesota. He is applied for dual citizenship. He did it the right way, and he works construction. And I still stay in touch with him. But that was just a shock, and to myself and Bill, as we learned about Alex's treacherous, him and his wife, a treacherous trip from Havana through Central America, up through Mexico, and then over to Miami. And now, why Minnesota? I have no idea. But he is now in Minnesota. But what a time. You know, going back, and I talked a little bit about lecturing at the University of Havana and lecturing on behavioral economics, and just thinking about a couple of the challenges there just brings up a couple of very short stories. And I know this time is flying by. One of the things I remember, well, there are three distinct things that I remember. I mean, I remember a lot, but these things stand out. One was we were in one of those underground classrooms where there are no windows. And they had one of their rolling blackouts because they have trouble with power, right? I mean, they have trouble with power, they have trouble with sewer, and they have trouble with water. And so you have to be careful about, staying healthy and that sort of thing. But we're down there one day, and I'm lecturing one of those bottom classrooms in the basement, and the power goes out. It's pitch black. And just I mean, it was second nature. And I have 40 students in there, and by this time, everybody has cell phones. Every single one of them at almost the exact same time lit up their phones. It brightened the room. We lectured that way for 2 hours until the power came back on. And it made an indelible mark on me about just some things that I take for granted that I shouldn't. And so it did. It holistically changed me when it comes to thinking about just what I'm thankful for. Another thing that really sticks out to me is that each time we lectured, and it would be a different 30 or 40 students. And each time those students would scrape together whatever pennies they'd had and bought me a gift on my way out. And so I have every one of them. I have a story with every one of those gifts. And they were, while they're, the cost of those gifts were not a lot. It's probably the most meaningful gifts I've ever had. And so I think this is a good time to say that the Cuban people are wonderful. They're full of life. They're curious. They're resilient. They're very, very aware of perceptions of them beyond the island. It is the Cuban government that's the issue. It is not the Cuban people. It is not. And I am, there may be some old schoolers that are, that are in Cuba that are still part of the Communist Party and that sort of thing. But you talk to the younger sect in Cuba, and they want more. They want to be able to socialize with the rest of the world and to participate in the world's economy. And certainly it's a shame that they cannot. They do in a way, and if I have a chance, I'll talk a little bit more about that. But generally speaking, they do not. Um, the last story about University of Havana students that I'll tell was so I'm a behavioral economist by trade. I've spent my entire career measuring why people make irrational decisions and how they make them, and literally, better understanding how we can frame decision architecture to force you into a certain decision if that's what we wanted to do. Uh, but so in teaching, so I'm literally teaching capitalism and decision choice architecture to Cuban students. And so I show up the first day, the first week of my lecture, and I'm excited about it. And I get up in front of the class, and the very first thing I say, and if any of you know me very well, you'll hear me use the word value a lot because value really it is the one word that is most important. One of the most important words that we use, one in business, one in personal relationships, because value is the perceptions about quality divided by the perceptions about price. Okay, so whether that's what you perceive the quality of a good that you buy relative to the perceptions about the price you pay, or the perceptions about a store you go to relative to the perceptions of the price you pay to get there. Maybe the parking's bad, maybe they don't wait on you, maybe the store's dirty, whatever it is. There's perceptions about quality divided by perceptions about price. Well, when I first started lecturing, I said, well, how many of you, what is your concept of value? Because that's the premise of my entire week-long lecture. And crickets. Nobody said anything. And it didn't dawn on me. Well, they don't even think about the word value because they have no choice. There's no choice. If you're lucky enough to have enough money to buy shampoo, you certainly only have one choice and one price. And so, I remember internally, it's like, oh my God, this is going to be a long week. I panicked a little bit internally, tried to remain cool on the outside, and it dawned on me that okay, so Cuba's very Latino, a very Latin oriented society where everyone takes care of each other. Grandmothers and grandfathers live with the rest of the community, and there's big sense of community. And so it just dawned on me. I said, "How many of you are in a relationship?" And everyone raised their hand. And I said, "Well, have you ever felt like you were giving more than you were getting?" That's how I explained the concept of value. And then we eased over into how it works in the free markets and in capitalism and that sort of thing. And man, I mean, the questions they had were very telling, very interesting, but they are exceedingly smart people, exceedingly smart people. And so they learned about decision choice architecture, about capitalism, about the differences between their economy and our economy. And, I was completely transparent about everything. And obviously, my lectures were being monitored. I really didn't have any fear whatsoever relative to that, but maybe I should have down the line, and I'll explain to that in just a few minutes. But in this PowerPoint, I'm glad to share this PowerPoint with you. I want to go through this really quickly because you'll see some of the pictures on the right side. You can see the old cars. Obviously, that's what Cuba's known for. As and they're masterful. They're masterful at keeping these 1950s American cars running to this day. Um, and the bottom picture, it was during what they call Carnival, and this was in downtown Havana. Just a beautiful time. You'll see a lot of school children in the picture, etc. And on the left side of the screen, I do talk. I've already talked about a little bit about that with the Cuban rations and the lifeline of socialism, and their staples. They would get rice, beans, sugar, cooking oil, coffee, eggs, bread, some chicken, fish, and pork and beef. But this is now significantly limited. And so many of them rely on the black market, which I will definitely touch on before I leave here. Um, so this is a picture I took inside of a Cuban classroom, and you can see that the Cuban students are all in the same uniform. They all have chores to do. It was very structured. And here's one of the most interesting things. This was the week that Hugo Chavez had died. And so they had all rolled in, and I don't know if you all remember, and I'm probably older than a lot of you, but they used to roll in TVs for us to watch something. Well, this was their system now, and they had rolled in these TVs to watch CNN because it was ongoing coverage of Hugo Chavez and his memorial. So it was just fascinating. And so, yeah, so Cuba really relies on a black market if you're wealthy enough. And so this became apparent to me early on. You know, and here's the thing about Alex. And Bill and I learned really quickly, man, you got to watch what you say out loud, because if you say it out loud, Alex is going to go make it happen. So I could say, man, I really wish I had a blank, whatever it was. I really wish I had a cigar. Alex would show up like he would disappear, and 20 minutes later he'd show up with a cigar. So we had to be very careful. But he explained to me, hey, look, you gotta. I said, Alex, I would love to take a box of cigars back with me to the United States. I realize it's not completely legal, but other people do it. Or I'd like to take some rum back because I like to give them out as Christmas gifts. And he says, sure, sure, I make that happen. He says, I said, well, how are you going to make it happen? He says, well, okay. He says, I'm going to show you. And he got on the phone, he's speaking Spanish, and he says, in 10 minutes, a man's going to come by on a motorcycle. And this exchange is going to take place very quickly. You're going to grab the goods and walk inside, and I'm going to pay him. So, okay. Sure enough, exactly 10 minutes later, here comes this guy on a scooter. He stops. He hands me these things. I walk back in the hotel lobby, and Alex comes in like a minute later. And this had me intrigued. So then I started going down this massive black hole about black markets. And so in 2016, Bill and I, along with some other international panelists, were invited to present at Hominis. Hominis is an international, I mean, it's a hemispheric conference. I think there were 45 nations. There were there were present along with about 5,000 attendees. And it was really interesting. So the very first day, and they're packed in, and this is this massive auditorium where, if you've ever seen the old earpieces that you wear for translation, everything that everyone said was translated into English and Portuguese or Spanish, depending on what language you were using. And our friend that I told you before that was president of the Cuban Society of Psychologists was the chairman of the conference. And while we're sitting there listening, he says, look, I want everyone to please be sure to attend the last session of the week, which is an international panel. And on that international panel, this was in looking back a significant risk. And they were attempting to move along this academic and economic freedom. And when I say they, I mean the scholars in Cuba. And so on this panel, they put me, who was taking a deep dive into Cuba's black market. They put on Bill, which was comparing the U.S. and the Cuban Constitution. They flew in a professor from the University of Vienna who was talking about international tax systems. And they had another professor from the University of Havana, which was kind of tying all this together. And so, a couple of stories here, and I know I've got to finish soon. I'll show you the rest of the pics. But I remember sitting there after Alexei was announcing that, and people turning around looking. There was a reporter that came up to me, and the reporter it caught me off guard because the reporter was blonde-headed, and you don't see many blonde-headed people in Cuba, but she spoke eloquent Spanish, which was translated to me. And essentially, she was asking for an interview, but she wanted to do it. This was on a Monday, and we were scheduled to be the last panel of the week on a Friday. And she says, and I think at like 11 a.m. She said, I'd love to interview you on state TV at 10 a.m. on Friday. And I didn't know whether to say yes or no. And Alexei Ruiz, who was the president of the conference, I looked over at him and he says, okay. He said, but don't say anything. In other words, just kind of nod and grin, say you're happy to be there. And I was still a little bit worried about being on state TV. That was not an agreement with the State Department, and I didn't know, what we're allowed and not allowed to do, but I agreed to do it. And so, I would say that entire week I worried about that a little bit. I was concerned about it, just because, probably not a good thing to do. And God knows where else this would have been. It could have ended up on CNN or something where, I could have gotten in trouble, even though I wasn't going to say anything. So anyway, I show up and I'm waiting on this person at 10 a.m. near where the conference facility is, and nobody shows up. And let me back up. The reason I was caught off guard was that, and because the lady had blonde hair, was because she was Russian, and she had stayed behind after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and kind of made her home in Cuba. Well, anyway, I'm waiting there, and some gentleman walks up and hands me a piece of paper, and I have this piece of paper framed in my office. And all it says in broken English is, and I can't remember the reporter's name, but um, essentially I'm paraphrasing, she is not available. There will be no interview. Whoa. So I thought, I'm thinking, what happened to this lady? I mean, I hope she's okay. I was a little bit relieved there was no interview. But so then we got to the time for me to present, and I'm presenting a lot of information that no one knew, that was new to me, that Cuba was able to suppress quite a bit. And it dawned on me about midway through this presentation, this is not a good idea. This is not a good idea. And then that was affirmed by 1,000 when Bill got up and started comparing the Cuban and U.S. Constitution, followed by the University of Vienna professor who was discussing international taxation. And I remember going back and sitting down next to Bill, and I said, Bill, we're never getting out of here. I said, I'm telling you. And look, there's been a couple of brushes, like I said, we would notice that some people might be following us around, fine, whatever. And there are a couple of times when I've been asked to, you know, uh, provide information about why I'm there, what I'm doing, blah, blah, blah. But this felt different. So anyway, finished the conference, went out to dinner. Getting ready to leave the next morning. There's obviously a charter flight out, and so a little bit nervous, but so you go through, and the way that their TSA is, they have facial recognition software. You go through and you stare at the facial recognition software, which feels like for hours, but it's only about a minute. And that person keeps looking at you. And look, I've got at that point, probably 15 Cuban stamps on my passport. Bill's got Cuban and Russian stamps in his passport. And so we're just a walking time bomb, I felt like. So anyway, I got through, and Bill got through. And I go, God, thank God, we're through. Uh, um, and not 2 minutes after I said that, somebody comes and taps me on the shoulder, and he says, Dr. Bradley, come with me. And this dude has a machine gun and a big German Shepherd. And so and I went with the guy, and he put me in a room. There was no windows. There was one chair, and he says, "What are you doing here?" I says, "Well, I was here. I was lecturing at Hominis." And he said, "That's impossible." I said, "No, sir, I'm telling you, it's." So this went on and on and on and on. And in the back of my mind, and I know we've only got a few minutes, in the back of my mind, um, I was concerned because there had been others imprisoned in Cuba for as little as having more than multiple cell phones. Internationals having multiple cell phones. So accuse them of being spies. So I'm going, I'm thinking worst case scenario, man, I may never see my family again, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, bottom line is, it dawned on me that this was after about 25, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. It dawned on me that I had the dean of the College of Psychology at the University of Havana. I had her business card in my wallet. I pulled it out and I said, call her. So he grabbed it and he runs out of the room. I didn't have Alexi's card with me. So he comes back in about 15 minutes. He says, "You are free to leave." I got up out of there. I walked out as quickly as I could and literally was able to get on that plane 1 minute before the door closed by the grace of God. Otherwise, I would have been stuck again, and God knows what would have happened. So I was detained maybe 3, 4, 5 times in Cuba. That was the hairiest of all of them, though, and I certainly was concerned at that particular time. Um, and it's some other time I'll talk about all these other things, but look, they use a lot of underground digital services now. Clearly, you can see on the right, you can see pictures of a guy which essentially looks like a food truck on wheels, and below, that's the El Presidente, the hotel. I've stayed there a few times. Um, we'll talk about freelancers at some other time. because there is a lot of freelancing, but I'm taking a picture at the University of Havana. Here you see me, gosh, that was when I was lifting a lot of weights. I was probably 40 pounds heavier. But anyway, that's at the Floridita. That is a bronze bust of Hemingway, who is revered in Cuba. And you can see below again, they're selling churros with those food trucks, which were now legal, which was very interesting. There I am at a Cuban Major League Baseball game. And below that is again a just an idea of what Cuban streets look like with all the foreign cars. Again, you can see that the picture. These are goods for sale. Just this is right across the street from the University of Havana. This is interesting. I took this picture. This book rack was outside. If you look closely at those books, you will see the sheer amount of propaganda. It's everywhere. It is absolutely everywhere. And again, I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with you so you can blow those titles up and look at them. And it tells you a lot about what you need to know in Cuba. Up top, I took that from I believe maybe the El Presidente. I'm not sure which hotel I was at that time, but that's a kind of a towering a picture of Havana, and below is where I'm receiving the Cuban letter of acknowledgement from the government of Cuba, particularly the Cuban Society of Psychologists at that time, and that was in, I believe, 2015. Then you can see another picture of Cuban classrooms. You can see the school children walking outside after class. Um, you can see this is downtown Havana, kind of one of the back streets. Um, this was probably it was slow, so probably a Sunday. And then you can see a couple of the photos of downtown Cuba. One of my favorite pictures ever. These two gentlemen, we stopped and talked to them with a translator with Alex, but they were making parts for this vehicle, literally making parts. And so they did this for 2 or 3 days, and about the fourth day, we were walking by, we were walking from the hotel. They had this vehicle running. It was just fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And then you can see some other photos of downtown Cuba. And then one other thing that I wanted to cover really quickly, you see other photos. One last thing is where I was inadvertently involved in some propaganda, believe it or not. The Cuban Five, group of Cuban intelligence officers arrested in Miami in 1998. Anyway, to make a very long story short, we released them. The United States released them, I believe it was in 2016, 2014 to 16. Anyway, they had a huge ceremony. And we were asked to attend. Well, when we were asked to attend, we couldn't say no. But we had one of the persons that went with us at that time was the head of Harley Davidson, and he absolutely refused to go, and understand why. Harley Davidson is an American brand, and this was very controversial at the time. It was a major diplomatic conflict between the U.S. and Cuba, and we were asked to be there to make it seem like it was okay, and it's clearly not. Um, there's a lot of backstory there relative to the Cuban Five. I believe that Bill and I were the first, uh, perhaps, Americans to meet them on Cuban soil. But ultimately, that was a problem for me with having to kind of being railroaded into having to be there was an issue. But nonetheless, man, what a great time in my life. What a way to change my context and perspective on everything. But remember, Cuba has not changed. State controlled media and messaging. Um, they do try some significant influence. They exert significant influence over their people, and they export revolution in their ideological influence. So, and I have some conclusions there for you to read later, but then I apologize. If Linda, if you will get me all of these questions, I will personally answer each one of the questions and send it out. I'll send it back to you, Linda, and you can just distribute to everyone. I apologize. Like literally, I could keep talking for another 4 hours. So my apologies, folks. Hope you found it reasonably interesting, and I'm always happy to talk about this subject.
Fascinating, just fascinating, Dr. Bradley. Thank you. Yes, I will read through the chat. I don't see any questions at this point, just praise for your wonderful and very interesting perspective on Cuba. So thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for attending.
Thanks, everyone.